Ma'am, you need to leave. Right now. The words cracked through the crowded lobby of City Hall like a dropped glass in a quiet church. Conversation stalled. Heads turned. The clicking of dress shoes against polished marble slowed to a stop. Near the security checkpoint, a black woman stood alone beneath the tall windows that stretched nearly 20 feet toward the ceiling. Sunlight poured through the glass and painted long golden lines across the floor. She wore a navy blazer, simple slacks, and comfortable walking shoes. No entourage, no security detail, no badges hanging around her neck. Nothing about her appearance suggested power. That was exactly why Officer Daniel Mercer had noticed her. He stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed he was protecting an important event. His uniform was pressed perfectly. His radio crackled softly against his shoulder. "This event is restricted," he said, extending his hand toward the visitor badge clipped to her jacket. "You can't just wander in here." The woman looked at him calmly. Not angry, not embarrassed, not intimidated, just calm. Around them, city officials, reporters, business leaders, and invited guests continued filtering through the grand entrance of City Hall. Today was one of the biggest public events of the year. The mayor was expected to announce a major infrastructure initiative worth hundreds of millions of dollars. News cameras lined the walls. Local journalists checked notes on tablets. Staff members hurried through the corridors carrying folders and schedules. Everyone seemed to be moving with purpose. Everyone except the woman standing before Officer Mercer. "I'm not wandering," she said softly. Her voice was measured and steady. "I'm exactly where I intended to be." Mercer frowned. He had heard that tone before. Calm people sometimes created the biggest problems. "Do you have an invitation?" he asked. "No." "A government credential?" "No." "Press clearance?" "No." A few nearby guests exchanged looks. One businessman adjusted his tie and smirked. A woman holding a coffee cup glanced over her shoulder before whispering something to her colleague. Mercer nodded slowly as if the situation had already been decided. "Then you can't be here." The woman folded her hands in front of her. "Interesting." Mercer narrowed his eyes. "What's interesting?" She glanced around the enormous lobby. The American flag stood near the main staircase. Historic photographs covered the walls. Portraits of former governors and civic leaders overlooked the crowd. "I always find it interesting," she said, "how quickly people decide who belongs in a room." The comment drew a few uncomfortable looks. Mercer felt irritation rising in his chest. He had a job to do, and he didn't have time for philosophical conversations. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I'm asking you politely. Please head back outside." The woman didn't move. The lobby seemed quieter now. People were listening openly. Some reporters had stopped pretending not to watch. A camera operator subtly adjusted his lens in their direction. Mercer reached toward the visitor badge hanging from her blazer and lifted it between two fingers. "What exactly is your purpose here today?" he asked. The woman looked at the badge, then back at him. "To observe." "Observe what?" "How people are treated." The answer landed strangely. Mercer wasn't sure why, but for a brief moment it unsettled him. Then the sound of laughter broke the tension. Someone nearby chuckled under their breath. Another guest shook his head. The spell was broken. Mercer straightened his posture. "Well, observation time is over." He gestured toward the doors. "Please come with me." The woman finally turned her gaze toward the grand staircase at the center of the building. Her eyes lingered there for only a second. Then she nodded once. "If that's what you believe is necessary." Mercer motioned toward the exit. Around them, the crowd slowly parted. The sunlight continued spilling across the marble floor. The city's most powerful people stood only yards away, completely unaware that the most important guest in the building had already arrived. Victoria Brooks walked without resistance. Her pace was unhurried, almost thoughtful, as if she were touring a museum instead of being escorted toward the front entrance of City Hall. Officer Daniel Mercer stayed. Beside her, his expression firm, his attention fixed on the task he believed he was completing correctly. Around them, conversation slowly resumed, but not entirely. Curious eyes followed every step. Some guests watched openly. Others pretended not to. The polished marble floor reflected the movement of expensive shoes, rolling camera cases, and city employees carrying folders from one meeting room to another. Victoria noticed everything. She noticed the maintenance worker pushing a cart near the west hallway. She noticed the receptionist who smiled warmly at executives but avoided eye contact with ordinary visitors. She noticed the young black intern standing near a column, watching silently from across the lobby. Most of all, she noticed how differently people behaved depending on who they thought someone was. That was why she had come alone. 3 hours earlier, before sunrise painted the skyline in shades of gold and blue, Victoria had parked a 10-year-old sedan nearly 2 blocks away from City Hall. She could have arrived with a motorcade. She could have traveled with state security officers and advance teams. Instead, she drove herself through the city she represented. The leather steering wheel felt worn beneath her hands. The coffee in the cup holder had gone cold long before she reached downtown. She preferred it that way. Real answers rarely appeared behind tinted windows. They appeared on sidewalks, in waiting rooms, and in ordinary conversations. For months, reports had crossed her desk describing concerns about public access, treatment of residents, and growing complaints from neighborhoods that felt forgotten. Statistics filled pages. Charts showed trends. Consultants wrote summaries. But Victoria trusted her own eyes more than reports. Numbers explain what happened. People explained why. So she came without announcement. No press release. No warning. No special accommodations. Just a woman walking into a public building to see how public servants treated the public. As she approached the main entrance earlier that morning, nobody recognized her. The security volunteer holding the door barely glanced in her direction. 2 city contractors walked past without a second look. A reporter hurried by while speaking into a phone and nearly bumped into her shoulder without noticing. Victoria had smiled to herself. It was familiar. She had spent years moving through rooms where people underestimated her before she ever spoke. Sometimes because she was a woman. Sometimes because she was black. Sometimes because she did not fit their image of authority. The years had taught her something important. People often revealed their true character before they learned who you were. Now, back in the present, she and Mercer continued toward the front doors. The morning sun streamed through the glass entrance and warmed the stone beneath their feet. Outside, flags moved gently in the breeze. Television vans lined the curb. Across the street, residents gathered behind temporary barriers hoping to witness the mayor's announcement. Mercer glanced toward the doors and then back at Victoria. Something about her composure continued to bother him. Most people argued. Some complained. Others became defensive. She did none of those things. Her calm seemed almost impossible. "You are taking this surprisingly well," he finally said. Victoria looked at him. Taking what well? Being removed. A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I have learned that moments like this are usually more revealing than upsetting." Mercer frowned. Revealing of what? Victoria's eyes drifted toward the crowd moving through the lobby behind them. Of who people become when they think nobody important is watching. For the first time, Mercer did not immediately respond. The answer lingered between them. Somewhere above, a microphone crackled to life inside the main assembly chamber. Staff members began directing guests toward the auditorium. The event was about to begin. Neither of them realized that within minutes, every person inside City Hall would be talking about the same woman now being quietly escorted toward the exit. Inside the main assembly chamber, the atmosphere felt very different from the lobby outside. Bright television lights reflected off polished wood panels. Rows of reserved seats stretched across the room, slowly filling, with donors, business leaders, department heads, and local reporters. Every chair seemed occupied by someone important or someone hoping to become important. At the front of the room, a large stage displayed the city seal beneath 2 American flags. A podium stood at the center, waiting for Mayor Richard Coleman. Staff members moved briskly between aisles carrying clipboards and schedules. Every detail had been rehearsed. Every camera angle had been planned. The mayor's communications director checked her watch for the 4th time in less than 2 minutes. A production assistant adjusted microphone levels. Near the front row, several executives exchanged quiet conversation about contracts and development projects that would benefit from the funding announcement scheduled for that morning. Everything appeared orderly. Everything appeared under control. Yet one problem continued to trouble the mayor. Richard Coleman stood behind a curtain near the side entrance, reviewing his notes. He was a man who rarely showed uncertainty in public, but today he found himself glancing repeatedly toward the auditorium doors. The special guest had still not arrived. 2 weeks earlier, the governor's office had confirmed attendance. The appearance was expected to strengthen public confidence in the city's new initiative. State and local leaders standing together would send a powerful message. At least that had been the plan. Now the event was minutes from beginning. The governor's seat remained empty. Richard turned toward his chief of staff. "Have you heard anything?" he asked quietly. "Nothing yet," she replied. The governor's office confirmed this morning that she was coming. Richard exhaled slowly. Traffic? Possible. Security delay? Maybe. Neither answer sounded convincing. Across the room, reporters had already begun noticing the empty, reserved chair near the stage. A few whispered among themselves while checking their phones. News traveled quickly in political circles. Questions traveled even faster. Richard adjusted his tie and looked again toward the entrance. Something felt wrong. Meanwhile, outside the auditorium, Officer Daniel Mercer continued guiding Victoria Brooks through the main lobby. The crowd had thinned slightly as guests moved toward the event. The building felt quieter now, but the silence carried a different weight. Several people still watched them. A city employee standing near the information desk frowned as Victoria passed. An elderly resident waiting for a permit appointment shook his head disapprovingly. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, yet many seemed comfortable assuming they did. Victoria noticed that too. She always did. Near the second-floor balcony overlooking the lobby, a young assistant stepped out of an office carrying folders. She glanced down casually and immediately stopped walking. Her eyes widened. For a brief moment, she looked confused, then shocked. She stared at Victoria, looked away, then looked back again. The folders nearly slipped from her hands. Victoria recognized the expression instantly. Recognition. The assistant disappeared from the railing so quickly that she almost seemed to vanish. Down below, Mercer remained unaware. "The exit is just ahead," he said. Victoria nodded politely. "I can see that." They continued forward. Above them, the assistant rushed through a hallway and nearly collided with another staff member. "Where is the mayor?" she asked breathlessly. "Backstage. I need to speak with him immediately. The event starts in 5 minutes." "It cannot wait." Back inside the preparation area, Mayor Coleman was taking a final sip of water when the assistant arrived. She stopped several feet away, struggling to catch her breath. "Sir," she said, "I think there is a problem." Richard lowered the bottle. "What kind of problem?" The young woman hesitated. Even she could barely believe what she had seen. "The guest everyone is waiting for," she said. "I think she is already here." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" The assistant swallowed hard. "And I think security is escorting her out of the building." The lobby fell silent in a way that felt almost unnatural. The steady rhythm of footsteps disappeared. Conversations stopped halfway through sentences. Even the reporters who had been speaking into microphones lowered their voices. Every eye followed Mayor Richard Coleman as he crossed the marble floor. His pace was urgent, but his expression revealed something deeper than urgency. It was concern, genuine concern. Officer Daniel Mercer stood motionless near the entrance. For the first time that morning, uncertainty crept into his thoughts. The mayor rarely left a scheduled event once preparations were complete. He certainly did not sprint across City Hall because of an ordinary visitor. Yet here he was. Victoria Brooks remained calm. Her hands rested comfortably at her sides. Sunlight from the glass entrance illuminated one side of her face, while the polished floor reflected the movement of the approaching crowd. Several staff members followed behind the mayor. Reporters quickly gathered nearby, sensing a story unfolding in real time. Camera operators repositioned themselves. Phones appeared from pockets. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to anticipation. Something important was happening. Nobody knew exactly what. Mercer glanced toward Victoria. "Do you know the mayor?" he asked quietly. Victoria looked at him. "I have met him before." The answer only deepened his confusion. Before he could ask another question, Richard Coleman arrived. He stopped several feet away, breathing slightly harder than usual. For a brief moment, he simply stared at Victoria. The assistant standing behind him looked equally stunned. Around them, dozens of people waited for someone to explain what was going on. Richard finally spoke. "Good morning." Victoria smiled politely. "Good morning, Mayor Coleman." The formality of the exchange immediately caught everyone's attention. Mercer felt a strange sensation in his chest. The mayor knew her. Not casually, not vaguely. He knew exactly who she was. Yet Richard did not immediately explain. His eyes shifted toward Mercer, then back toward Victoria, then toward the growing crowd. The delay only increased the tension. Nearby, a reporter whispered, "What is happening?" Nobody answered. Mercer cleared his throat. "Sir, is there a problem?" Richard looked at him. The question seemed simple enough, but the mayor did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the situation, unfolding around them. The cameras, the guests, the city employees, the reporters. Hundreds of assumptions had already been made that morning, most of them wrong. Victoria watched quietly. She could see the realization spreading through Richard's mind. He understood exactly how bad this looked. More importantly, he understood why it mattered. This was not about a mistaken identity anymore. It was about how quickly people had decided who belonged and who did not. Across the lobby, the young black intern who had been watching earlier remained frozen beside a column. Her eyes never left Victoria. Neither did the eyes of several maintenance workers standing near the service hallway. They had witnessed everything. The city executives near the auditorium doors had witnessed it too. So had the reporters. So had the residents waiting for several long seconds, nobody spoke. The lobby seemed trapped inside a bubble of silence. Sunlight streamed through the towering glass entrance and spread across the marble floor in pale gold reflections. Dust particles drifted through the beams of light, moving slowly in the still air. Somewhere beyond the walls of City Hall, traffic continued flowing through downtown streets. Car horns sounded faintly in the distance. Life outside carried on normally. Inside, however, time felt suspended. Mayor Richard Coleman stood facing Victoria Brooks. Officer Daniel Mercer stood beside her. Reporters waited with cameras raised. Staff members remained frozen where they stood. Nobody wanted to move first. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Victoria glanced around the lobby. Her eyes moved from face to face. She saw curiosity. She saw confusion. She saw embarrassment beginning to surface in a few expressions. Most of all, she saw uncertainty. The certainty that had filled the room earlier was gone. Nobody seemed completely sure of anything anymore. Near the service hallway, a maintenance worker lowered his mop and quietly watched. Beside the information desk, an elderly woman waiting for assistance adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. The young black intern standing near the column remained motionless. Her badge hung from a blue lanyard around her neck. Her eyes reflected something Victoria recognized immediately. Hope. It reminded her of herself decades earlier. Before elections. Before titles. Before headlines. Before people learned her name. Back when she was simply a young woman trying to enter rooms that often assumed she did not belong. Victoria remembered those days clearly. She remembered arriving at meetings where people mistook her for support staff. She remembered being asked if she was in the correct room. She remembered watching assumptions form before she ever opened her mouth. The memories no longer hurt. Time had transformed them into lessons. Yet standing inside City Hall that morning, she realized how little had changed for some people. A title could open doors. Respect should not require one. The thought settled quietly in her mind. Nearby, Mercer shifted his weight. The confidence he had displayed earlier had faded. Not entirely, but enough. His eyes moved between Victoria and the mayor. He was trying to understand what he had missed. Trying to reconstruct the morning in his head. Every question, every answer, every assumption. The pieces no longer fit together as neatly as before. Richard Coleman noticed the same thing. The mayor glanced briefly toward the portraits lining the walls. Generations of leaders stared down from gilded frames. Men and women who had held offices of responsibility. People whose decisions shaped communities. Yet none of those portraits captured what leadership truly looked like in a moment like this. Leadership was not a title on a plaque. It was revealed by how people treated someone who appeared powerless. The realization weighed heavily on him. Across the lobby, several reporters exchanged whispers. Phones vibrated with incoming messages. Newsrooms wanted updates. Producers wanted explanations. But nobody had answers yet. The story remained unfinished. A camera operator adjusted focus and pointed his lens toward Victoria. She did not react. Her calm remained unchanged. The sunlight reflected softly against her navy blazer. Her posture remained relaxed. She looked less like someone caught in an uncomfortable situation and more like someone observing a lesson unfold in real time. The building's central clock ticked quietly above the staircase. Each second seemed louder than the one before. Tick, tick, tick. The delayed event waited upstairs. Hundreds of guests waited inside the auditorium. The city waited outside. Yet nobody moved. The silence itself had become part of the moment. Finally, Victoria turned her eyes toward the young intern near the column. Their gazes met briefly. The young woman straightened slightly. A small gesture, almost invisible, but meaningful. Victoria offered the faintest smile. The intern smiled back. In that exchange, something shifted. Not in the building, not in the event, in the people watching. Because for the first time that morning, many of them were no longer wondering who Victoria Brooks was. They were beginning to wonder how differently they might have treated her if they had known from the start. The silence finally broke when Mayor Richard Coleman took one deliberate step forward. The movement alone pulled every eye in the lobby toward him. Reporters raised cameras higher. Staff members stopped pretending to work. Even people standing near the entrance outside pressed closer to the glass, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Richard looked first at Officer Daniel Mercer, then at Victoria Brooks, then at the crowd gathered around them. He understood that whatever happened next would not stay inside City Hall. By sunset, the entire city would know, perhaps the entire state. The mayor drew a slow breath and spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Officer Mercer," he said, "please step back." Mercer obeyed immediately. Confusion remained written across his face. "Sir." Richard kept his eyes on Victoria. "Step back." The officer moved away without another word. The growing crowd shifted slightly. More people emerged from hallways and stairwells. The delayed ceremony upstairs had effectively emptied into the lobby. Business leaders stood beside maintenance workers. Reporters stood beside residents waiting for appointments. For a brief moment, status disappeared. Everyone shared the same question. Who was this woman? Richard turned toward the nearest camera crew. The red recording light glowed brightly. He knew the microphones were live. He knew every word would be captured. Yet there was no avoiding it now. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the marble lobby. "Before we continue with today's event, there is something that needs to be clarified." A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. Victoria remained still, calm, patient, the same way she had been all morning. Richard looked toward her once more. His expression softened. "The woman standing before you is not an unauthorized visitor." Several people exchanged puzzled looks. Mercer felt his stomach tighten. The reporters leaned forward. The young intern near the column covered her mouth with one hand. Richard continued, "She is not here by accident." The lobby grew even quieter, if that was possible, and she certainly does not need permission to enter this building. A reporter lowered his notebook. Another forgot to take photographs. Victoria's name had not yet been spoken, but realization was already beginning to spread through a few faces. The assistant standing beside the mayor watched the recognition travel through the room like a wave approaching shore. Richard finally turned completely toward the crowd. His voice became firm, clear, unmistakable. "This is Governor Victoria Brooks." The words landed with the force of absolute truth. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. For a second, nobody reacted. The statement seemed too large for the room to process. Then the silence shattered. Gasps echoed across the lobby. Reporters stared in disbelief. Phones instantly rose into the air. Conversations erupted from every direction at once. A business executive near the front entrance visibly paled. The elderly woman beside the information desk sat back in stunned silence. The maintenance worker lowered his eyes and shook his head slowly. The young black intern blinked rapidly as tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. Officer Daniel Mercer stood completely motionless. Every sound around him seemed distant, muffled, unreal. He looked at Victoria, then at the mayor, then back at Victoria again. The woman he had questioned, the woman he had escorted toward the door, the woman he had assumed did not belong. The governor met his gaze without anger, without triumph, without judgment. That somehow made the moment even harder. Richard continued speaking, but many people barely heard him. They were too busy replaying the morning inside their minds. Every glance, every assumption, every whispered comment, every conclusion drawn before a single fact was known. Victoria Brooks simply stood beneath the morning sunlight while the realization spread through City Hall. And in that moment, the most powerful person in the building looked exactly the same as she had an hour earlier. The only thing that had changed was what everyone else now knew. The lobby remained loud for several moments after the announcement. Reporters rushed to relay updates. Staff members exchanged stunned looks. Guests who had arrived expecting a routine political event now found themselves witnessing something entirely different. Yet as the initial shock faded, a new silence slowly emerged. It began with a few people, then more, until attention once again settled on Victoria Brooks. She stood exactly where she had been standing before her identity was revealed. The same navy blazer, the same calm expression, the same posture. Nothing about her had changed, only the way people looked at her. Mayor Richard Coleman stepped forward first. His face carried genuine regret, not the polished regret politicians displayed for cameras. Real regret, the kind that appeared when a lesson arrived unexpectedly. "Governor Brooks," he said, "on behalf of this city, I owe you an apology." The crowd grew quiet again. Richard glanced around the lobby. What happened this morning should not have happened. Not to you. Not to anyone. Several people lowered their eyes. Victoria listened without interrupting. The mayor continued. "You came here to serve the people of this state. Instead, you were questioned, judged, and nearly turned away from a public building." His voice echoed softly against the marble walls. "I am sorry." For a moment, nobody spoke. Cameras remained pointed toward Victoria. Reporters waited. The crowd waited. Everyone expected a response. Perhaps criticism. Perhaps anger. Perhaps a demand for accountability. Victoria slowly looked around the room. Her gaze moved across the faces gathered before her. She saw embarrassment. She saw reflection. She saw people confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm enough that people leaned forward to hear it. "Mayor Coleman," she said, "I accept your apology." A collective breath seemed to leave the room. Richard nodded gratefully. But Victoria was not finished. She turned slightly toward the crowd. Sunlight reflected softly across the polished floor beneath her feet. "The truth is," she continued, "this morning was never really about me." Confused expressions appeared throughout the lobby. Victoria gestured gently toward the entrance. Every day, people walk into public buildings hoping to be treated with dignity. Her eyes settled briefly on the maintenance worker near the hallway, then the elderly woman by the information desk, then the young intern standing near the column. Some are wealthy. Some are struggling. Some hold important titles. Most do not. The room remained silent. "The question is not whether a governor deserves respect." She paused. "The question is whether an ordinary person deserves the same respect before anyone knows who they are." No one answered. No one could. Officer Daniel Mercer stood motionless a few feet away. The words struck harder than any public criticism ever could. Because they were true. Victoria finally looked directly at him. The crowd followed her gaze. Mercer felt hundreds of eyes turn in his direction. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped. Victoria offered a small, understanding smile. "Officer Mercer was trying to do his job," she said. Several reporters exchanged surprised looks. They had expected blame. They had expected conflict. Instead, they found grace. Victoria continued. "What matters now is not what happened. What matters is what we learned from it." Mercer lowered his eyes briefly. The tension in his shoulders eased for the first time all morning. Across the lobby, the young intern smiled through tears. The maintenance worker nodded quietly. Even some reporters seemed less interested in the story and more interested in the lesson unfolding before them. Mayor Coleman looked around the room and realized that the event scheduled for that day had already happened. It was not upstairs at a podium. It was here, in this lobby, in this moment. Because the most powerful message anyone would hear all morning was not about funding, development, or politics. It was about dignity. And standing beneath the morning sunlight, Governor Victoria Brooks had just reminded an entire city what that word truly meant. The ceremony eventually resumed, but it felt different now. The speeches still happened. The cameras still recorded. The applause still echoed through the auditorium. Yet something had changed inside City Hall. People listened more carefully. They watched more closely. They seemed aware that the most important lesson of the day had arrived before the first official announcement ever reached the podium. Hours later, sunlight shifted across the city skyline as the event came to an end. Guests filtered toward exits. Reporters packed equipment into cases. Staff members collected programs and folded signs. The energy that had filled the building all morning slowly faded into the quiet rhythm of an ordinary afternoon. Near the front entrance, Officer Daniel Mercer stood alone for a moment beside the security desk. The lobby was nearly empty now. The marble floors reflected long bands of amber light from the western windows. For the first time all day, there was nothing demanding his attention. No crowd, no reporters, no cameras, just silence. He looked toward the glass doors where everything had begun. The memory replayed clearly in his mind. A woman standing alone. A simple conversation. A series of assumptions that now seemed impossible to ignore. Mercer sighed softly. He had spent years believing professionalism meant following procedures. Today had taught him that professionalism required something more. Seeing people before judging them. Listening before deciding. Understanding before assuming. The lesson lingered heavily in his thoughts. Across the lobby, the young intern stepped out. From a hallway carrying a stack of folders. She noticed Mercer standing there and paused briefly. Their eyes met. Neither said anything. Yet both seemed to understand that they had witnessed something they would remember for a very long time. Outside, a black sedan waited near the curb. Victoria Brooks emerged from the building without fanfare. No announcement followed her. No crowd surrounded her. The cameras had already moved on to other stories. She preferred it that way. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby park. Flags above City Hall moved gently against the blue sky. Victoria paused near the steps and looked back at the building one final time. The stone facade glowed softly beneath the late-day sun. People entered and exited through the same doors as always. From a distance, nothing appeared different. Yet she knew some things had changed. Not policies, not budgets. People. Sometimes change began quietly. A conversation, a realization, a moment that forced someone to see differently than before. She hoped that was enough. At the top of the steps, Mayor Richard Coleman appeared briefly. He raised a hand. Victoria returned the gesture with a warm smile. No words were necessary. The lesson had already been spoken. A few feet away, the young black intern exited the building carrying her bag. She stopped when she saw the governor. For a second, she seemed uncertain. Then Victoria smiled at her again. The young woman smiled back. It was a small exchange. Easy to miss. Yet something about it felt important. As if one generation were quietly telling another to keep walking forward. The intern stood a little taller. Victoria noticed. Then she opened the car door and took her seat. The sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the flow of afternoon traffic. City Hall grew smaller in the rear window. The governor rested comfortably against the seat and watched the city pass by. Children crossed intersections holding backpacks. Workers left offices carrying coffee cups. Residents waited at bus stops. Ordinary people moving through ordinary lives. The very people she had come to see. Back at City Hall, the last golden rays of sunlight stretched across the marble lobby. The portraits on the walls reflected the fading light. The building settled into evening quiet. Officer Mercer stood near the entrance and watched the shadows lengthen across the floor. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The flags outside continued moving gently in the wind. The doors opened. The doors closed. And in the silence that remained, the lesson stayed behind, lingering like sunlight on stone long after the day itself had ended.